The next part of this armature after the feet will be the hands. This is the more difficult part of making the armature because in a character this scale, the hands are absolutely tiny. So you could use very, very thin wire like this, which is just way too fine. What I'm going to use is the same thin wire I've been using for the rest of the armature. And I'm going to basically trace the wire for the length of the fingers of the character. So imagine that you're doing an outline over the thumb and over each finger. And that's the wire taking loops on for each finger. And the loops have to go deep enough and low enough and end in the palm of the hand of the character. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take some multi-layered wire of the same small thickness right here, which will be basically a wrist ending in the hand. And then this will be an independent thing that you can work on and eventually attach to your puppet. So let's start by doing 4 layers of this thin wire, 3 or 4 layers, and that becomes your wrist for later on. But now becomes the difficult part, like I said, where you have to use the drawing of your character and kind of trace the fingers. Now you could do 1 layer, but that's very dangerous once again because you have only 1 layer of the puppet of the wire for the finger, which could break. So what we're going to do is start off with a little piece like this and then bend it where the thumb's going to be. At this point I can use a tool just to kind of take that loop and make it a little bit smaller. You don't want to use it where the fingers are going to bend, but at the tips it's all right. So now the thumb is very tiny, and what I'm going to do now is straighten it out like that. And that basically is leading to the next finger. So I have to figure out how long that has to be, which is right about there. And I'm going to fold it over again. This wire should probably be a little bit longer to start with. You can always trim it. Maybe I'll just do 3 fingers instead of 4 just to make my life a little easier. But you can now see that we have a thumb and a finger. Sorry. You can see now that we have a thumb and a finger. Now I'm going to go on to the next finger, and I know the distance or the length of that finger, so I'm going to go up and then back down. And use my pliers again. So now you can kind of see I have 2 fingers and a thumb, and I'm going to go up another time, and I'm going to go back down like so. So now what I have, I'm getting close to having 3 fingers. I probably could have made it longer, and now you can kind of see the shape of a hand like that right there. It's a little easier to see against the paper. Even this is kind of too big for this character, but the design of this character is a little impractical. And if I had thinner wire, I could probably get them even smaller. But for this demonstration, the technique remains the same, but just the size is very different. So the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to bring some of these fingers closer together. And I'm going to do that by hand. And I'm just going to grab the fingers and kind of bend them closer, making the loops near the palm just getting a little closer together. This takes some very precise movements, and you have to kind of finesse the wire. You don't want to overbend it or get it all tangled up. You want to keep the fingers parallel, the wires for the fingers. So now you can kind of see it's starting to get even closer to the shape I want. Now you'll see that there's extra wire here for the palm of the hand. All you're going to do is kind of bend that back so that it kind of makes up the palm, like so. And the same thing with the extra wire on the other side. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay that just on top of this wire like this, and this is basically going to be the wrist and arm. At this point we're going to want to use another piece of electrical tape. So when you're using electrical tape, you carefully peel a piece like this and lay it on something that is kind of shiny so that you don't take away any of the adhesive keep your hands off of it basically, because that takes the adhesive away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it lengthwise, like so. And then I'm going to use the corner of the X-Acto blade to kind of peel it up. Now I have this nice piece, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to protect the wrist wire by putting a piece of tape there. This is important because a lot of characters will gesture a lot, and you want to protect this wire from being cut by the epoxy. So you're going to want to roll a few layers on there. So now I have my wrist wire. Now this is long, but it's going to be attached to the puppet up here. It could be trimmed later on. But the wire that's used for the arms is a little thicker because it needs to pose the arm. And what we're doing is making the wrist a little bit easier to pose, so that gives you even more control with the puppet when you're animating it. Okay, so once again what we're going to do is use some masking tape. And I'm going to immobilize the wrist wire, like so, and kind of flatten it out. And now I'm going to take my little hand, this hand here, and you could use any piece of paper, it really doesn't have to be this same paper. And I'm going to immobilize the hand by taping the fingers down. Okay, so now what I have is this little area open right here, which will become the wrist. What I think I'm going to do is pull this down just a little bit further. You want to make sure your palm doesn't get too large, because then you're going to have these giant hands that are impossible to pose. So just remember, when you're making your hand, the palm is tiny. It needs almost no epoxy to hold it together. And you don't want the epoxy to go past this wrist, because when I bend my hand, it bends here. So if there's epoxy here, it will bend even further and further away. So keep your epoxy tiny right there. So I've made that a little bit shorter there, and I'm going to reposition this tape and put the hand right there. Now that looks decent in that position, so I'm going to hold it still and tape it down. Okay, now at this point I'm going to mix a little bit more epoxy putty, but you can see right there that I can use a tiny bit of epoxy to kind of make up the palm. And you don't want to go too far up the fingers, and you don't want to go too far down on the wrist. So if you start putting epoxy here, it's going to ruin those hands because the length of the fingers will be eaten up by epoxy. So keep it right there. And the loops of the fingers have to kind of go down into the palm and back up and down, so that when the epoxy covers that palm area, it will trap all the wire. And now, so the next step is you mix some of your epoxy putty and you take off a very, very tiny piece. So what you can do is tear that little piece in half. And I tore it in half, and I snuck a little piece underneath the hand where the wire is. Okay, and then I'm taking the second half and I'm going to put it on top, and then I'm going to dip my finger in a little bit of water, and I'm just going to squish down like so. Now what that does is it basically does this really fast. You can kind of see where it makes up the palm. Now the palm is sticking out a little far over here. You're going to want to push that up. You're going to want to make sure eventually all these lower loops of the fingers get trapped in epoxy, but you could do that as a second step along with the donut for your wrist. And I tried to make the balls that I use for each palm about the same size. That'll help keep the hands a similar shape and size as well. So I've snuck half of the sphere underneath the wire, like so. And then I took the second half and put it on top. Again, stick some water in your hand and give it a squish. Now what that's done is it's sandwiched all the epoxy from top to bottom through all the wire. And again, right here is there's a red flag right here. You can see on this one right here, I'm starting to lose my thumb. It's getting buried in epoxy. So I'm going to carefully go in there and extract some of the epoxy away from that thumb and towards the palm so that I don't lose the ability to pose that thumb. Now you could do this in the second step, like I said. You don't want to move this wire around, you want it to set in place before you lift it off the paper and start making any changes to it. So just keep it small and thin. You don't want the hands to be giant paddles. If you're doing a feminine character, you're going to want that to be small and delicate. Look at the shape of a palm and a hand and keep that in mind when you're doing it. Okay, the hands are now set up. So peel the tape away. And you can take them off of the paper. And at this point, with epoxy, as long as you're very careful, you could sand and shape the epoxy if you need to, if the hands look a little bit large. Just whatever tools you end up using, be careful not to nick any of these wires, because these are your fingers and they're nice and posable and they should last for a good long time. So the next step we're going to do is make sure you line your armature up with your drawing. It's looking pretty close. Now what you're going to do is you're going to find the wrist, the end where the wrist ends for the drawing, and you're going to line everything up and then mark it with your thumb there and go and cut the wire. And why you're doing this is because we're going to be adding the wrist and hand wire to the armature itself. So line it up again and do the other side. Now, the next step I'm going to do is add a little bit of electrical tape to the ends of the wires, because these wires, once cut, are very, very sharp and we don't want them cutting into our wrists. Okay, so I've got the tape cut, and I'm just going to put a little bit at the end here. Now you have an option at this point. If you don't want to add your hands yet, you can. Because sometimes when you're making a costume for a puppet, it's very difficult to get the costume sleeve over the hand. So you can stop at this point and move on to another step for making your puppet, and then add your hands later on. And it might also be nice to have your hands separate for when you're finishing it, because you could cover it with latex, or you could use a flexible material called sugru. So right now, why don't we go in that direction? But just to explain the process, you're going to line your character up with the armature again, and you're going to put the arm or the hand that you built right up against the spot where you need it for your character, like that. Now this is kind of long, so what you'll probably do is just trim it down a little bit so that it doesn't go up towards the elbow. But we're going to lash that in place with a little bit of wire and then put a dab of epoxy on there. And then you'll have access to moving your wrist and having it fixed to the armature, so when you move the arm, it'll go with it. So we're going to keep this off and set this to the side so we can work on the hand separately. But this is your armature. The next step that we're going to do after this is a relatively easy one.